Fosse Mafia. Allora, metti il dio del dono. Cosa fai?
Fuck took so long?
Traffic the whole way.
Had to be done, right? Combattimento finito.
It started with Joe the Boss, a name that once sent chills through the backrooms of Broadway, the smoky parlors of Brooklyn, and the liquor warehouses lining the waterfront. He was Giuseppe Masseria, a man who clawed his way to the top of New York's underworld in the 1920s, commanding a loyal army of killers, bootleggers, and racketeers. He sat at the center of a sprawling empire that controlled the flow of liquor, gambling, and protection rackets. He was untouchable, until he wasn't. By April 15th, 1931, Masseria's time had run out. He was betrayed, gunned down in a Coney Island restaurant, playing his final hand of pinochle. The headlines screamed of his bloody demise, but the real story stretched back years, a decade of power struggles, territorial wars, and betrayals that had shaped the New York underworld. This short press bonanza will take you through the ruthless rise and violent fall of Joe Masseria, using real-time reports from newspapers spanning the 1920s to 1931. You will see the events unfold exactly as they were reported, with each article capturing the fear, chaos, and upheaval that defined the era. The early days of bloodshed. The press first took notice of Masseria in the early 1920s, when the city was already drowning in gangland vendettas. We'll dive into the New York underworld's brutal street battles, where men like Masseria fought for dominance. The murder of Frankie Yale and the war that followed will set the stage for what's to come. The gangland wars and Masseria's grip on power. As Prohibition fueled the rise of crime syndicates, Masseria became the undisputed king of the New York rackets. The articles will reveal how he expanded his influence, crushed his enemies, and ruled the city's underworld with an iron fist, until the cracks in his empire began to show. The rise of Charles, Lucky, Luciano. Before he was called a kingmaker, before he was the architect of the modern mafia, Luciano was just another ambitious gangster known as Lucania. The press followed his arrests, his connections to Arnold Rothstein, and his ascension under Masseria's shadow. You'll read how Luciano bided his time, maneuvering his way into power before ultimately betraying his own boss. The execution of Joe Masseria. The final chapter in Masseria's story came at a Coney Island restaurant in 1931, where he was set up by the very men he trusted. You will see the aftermath unfold through press reports, detailing how his killers vanished, how his family fought to give him a grand funeral that the city refused to allow, and how the power vacuum left behind sent New York's underworld into another violent spiral. The aftermath and the fall of the old guard. With Masseria dead, a new order began to take shape. The final articles will reveal how the New York underworld changed overnight, with Charlie Luciano emerging as the new power in town. You'll see how law enforcement, politicians, and even the federal government began shifting their attention to the rise of organized crime, a machine more sophisticated, more powerful, and deadlier than before. This is raw history, unedited, real-time reporting from the days when gangsters didn't just control the streets, they owned the front pages. Each article will be presented exactly as it appeared, with the newspaper name, date, and headline intact. You'll read the full, unfiltered accounts, just as the public did in those bloody years. This is not just the story of Joe Masseria. This is the death rattle of an old-world mafia boss and the dawn of the modern American underworld. The Bowery in the summer of 1922 was a hotbed of violence, a battleground where bullets settled disputes faster than words ever could. That August, the streets were thick with tension. and at the center of it all stood Giuseppe Joe Masseria, a man whose survival seemed to defy the laws of probability. He had already cheated death more times than anyone could count, but on this particular afternoon, fate, or maybe sheer dumb luck, was on his side again. He was standing in front of a store, casually watching the rhythm of the city, when the blue speedster pulled up. The doors flung open, and the air crackled with the thunderous bark of pistols. The shooters didn't hesitate. They came for blood. 4 bullets tore through his hat, but Masseria himself, by some cosmic joke, emerged almost completely unscathed, grazed only by a stray shot. The gunmen, realizing they had missed their mark, didn't have time to curse their bad aim. They hit the gas, tearing up 2nd Avenue, their tires screeching against the cobblestones. But the city had other plans for them. Up ahead, a mass of striking garment workers was spilling out of Beethoven Hall, clogging the street in an unmovable wave of humanity. There was no way through, at least not without force. The gunmen didn't think twice. They raised their pistols and opened fire on the crowd. Men and women screamed. Some ducked, some ran. Others weren't fast enough. 8 people dropped to the ground, bleeding. Their bodies were writhing in pain. In the chaos, the sea of people parted just enough for the speedster to punch through, escaping into the city's labyrinthine streets. The massacre sent shockwaves through the east side. The papers didn't hold back. "Gangster vendetta terrorizes city," the headlines screamed. For the cops, enough was enough. This wasn't just another turf war. This was open warfare in broad daylight, and the public wanted blood. By the time the dust settled, the NYPD had unleashed a manhunt like never before. At least 50 detectives, hardened, ruthless men who had no patience for omertà, were sent out into the streets. The orders were simple. Drag in anyone who so much as whispered Masseria's name. The target, Joe himself. He had barely recovered from his latest brush with death when they threw him in front of Magistrate Duros. This time, there would be no walking free. No quick bail. The assistant district attorney made it clear. Masseria wasn't just a threat to his enemies. He was a danger to the public, to anyone unlucky enough to be caught in the crossfire. But the real trigger for his arrest wasn't just the attempted hit on his life. It was the corpse of Umberto Valenti. Valenti had been more than just another gangster. He was a feared and dangerous rival. A man who played the same deadly game as Masseria, but had finally run out of luck. 2 days after the failed ambush in the Bowery, Valenti was gunned down at the corner of 12th Street and 2nd Avenue. Whoever pulled the trigger had vanished like ghosts, leaving behind nothing but bodies and unanswered questions. A street sweeper named Joseph Shepis took a bullet to the throat. An innocent woman, Agnes Eglinger, 51 years old, was left bleeding out with a gunshot wound to the chest. Bellevue Hospital was packed with the dying and the barely clinging to life. The police weren't just dealing with a mob war anymore. They had a full-blown crisis on their hands. Now all they needed was someone to blame. Masseria wasn't formally accused of Valenti's murder, but the cops weren't about to let him slip through their fingers. He was held on suspicion of homicide, and, if they couldn't pin the killing on him, they'd bury him under the weight of the city's growing frustration with the bloodshed. But that was the problem. Nobody talked. Not the dead man's crew, not Masseria's men, not the bystanders who had watched the carnage unfold. The detectives knew the truth was buried somewhere in the silence, but breaking omertà was a tall order. The real story of the feud was so twisted and layered with deception that even seasoned lawmen found themselves lost in its tangled web. So they turned the East Side into a war zone of their own, squeezing informants, kicking down doors, staking out gambling parlors and bootlegging dens. They were determined to break Masseria's grip, to bring order to a city where men like him ruled the streets with bullets and fear. But if history had taught them anything, it was this. Joe Masseria wasn't easy to kill, and he sure as hell wasn't easy to take down. Not yet. On Sunday, August 11th, 1929, the world of Masseria and countless other underworld titans was shaken by headlines screaming of the latest failure from the New York Police Department. A failure painted in blood and shadow, with a name that rang through the alleys and tap rooms. Frank Marlo. The Marlo affair, as the papers cynically described it, had become something out of the nursery rhyme 10 Little Indians. Except in this macabre rendition, the Indians were witnesses. One by one, they vanished from the picture, some through fear, others through sudden untimely silences, until only the echoes of their testimony remained, lost in the thick fog of the city's underworld. And at the heart of the uproar stood a man who had suddenly become a lightning rod for every whisper and curse from Tammany Hall to the mean streets of Little Italy. Police Commissioner Grover Whalen. The ink-stained critics of the city's morning papers tore into Whalen with venom usually reserved for scoundrels and scabs. He was polished, yes, tailored to perfection, they said, but tailored for parties, not for manhunts. His greatest crime, they sneered, was talking too much and delivering too little. Unlike the grim, silent detectives who let results speak for them, Whalen preferred the air of grand pronouncements and sweeping promises. But for all his speeches, the streets still ran red. The public, already seething from the botched Rothstein investigation, saw Whalen as a parade marshal masquerading as a lawman, a man more familiar with champagne toasts than bootleg raids. His critics chuckled that Whalen should have cut his teeth chasing criminals somewhere other than the polished deck of the S. Macomb. Yet to his credit, Whalen's failure wasn't for lack of effort. He threw every ounce of his tailored frame into cracking the Marlo case, pushing his men, making bold predictions, and promising justice. But the underworld, ever cold and cunning, offered only dead ends and silent witnesses. His optimism, relentless, even naive, clashed bitterly with the hard truths of the city's blood-soaked backrooms. Because this, after all, was an underworld murder. And underworld murders, as any hood or cop could tell you, were the toughest nuts to crack. The dead man, Frank Marlo, was no stranger to the shadows. Born in Gandolfo Curto on Prince Street, Manhattan, his life was a tapestry woven with violence. By the time he reached the grizzled age of 45, ancient by gangster standards, he had seen more of the underworld's teeth than most men lived to tell. His first brush with the law came in 1908, a burglary charge that the courts swept aside. By 1909, his mugshot had been plucked from the rogues gallery by order of the court, a rare quiet erasure in a city where men like him were usually remembered only in rap sheets and obituaries. But Marlo was more than a thug. He was an operator. A manager of prize-fighters and nightclubs, a player in the racetrack syndicates, and a mover of illegal liquor through the arteries of the Prohibition underworld. He even dipped his fingers into the grease paint and footlights of the theatre business, rubbing shoulders with the bright stars of the stage while making fortunes in the shadows behind the curtain. In the ring, his stable was formidable. He had managed some of the toughest men to ever lace up gloves, including Johnny Wilson, a former world middleweight champion. Another was Jack Delaney, who would soon wear the light heavyweight crown, but not under Marlo's banner. In a move that would haunt his wallet, Marlo had sold Delaney's contract to Pete Riley for $15,000, just before Delaney claimed the title. Fortune, it seemed, always had a sense of irony. But in the end, it wasn't fists, horses, or liquor that defined Marlo's legacy. It was a bullet and a police commissioner's broken promises. And for the mobsters who ran New York's underworld, from Masseria on down, the real lesson of the Marlo case was a simple, chilling one. In their world, witnesses didn't just vanish. They were made to vanish. And the cops, no matter how many speeches they made, were always a step too late. In the last fading year of his life, the luck that had once clung to Frank Marlo like a second skin seemed to have abandoned him entirely. His fighters, once champions and contenders, were losing more bouts than they were winning. His prized horses, which had once thundered down the tracks and lined his pockets with winnings, had turned into expensive disappointments. Marlo, ever the gambler, tried his hand in the nightclub racket. In 1926, he bought into the Club Rendezvous, a joint with music, booze, and a crowd that paid well for the privilege. But that venture soured too. He sold out to Larry Fay, the notorious bootlegger, for $10,000 and walked away. The Silver Slipper, though, that was different. Perched on 48th Street and Broadway, it was a hot spot, a cash cow. Marlo had a piece of it alongside his old pal, Johnny Wilson, and Bill Duffy, a known power player in the fight and entertainment world. It was at the Slipper, where Marlo could be found most nights, shadow in his own kingdom. No grand entrances, no boasting. Just Marlo, seated in the background, his eyes watchful, his face a mask of indifference as the music played and the cash flowed. But if his business life had turned sour, his home life was positively curdled. He had separated from his wife back in 1923, a split that festered into a bitter standoff. Whispers spread after his death that he had been making moves to cut the final tie, to divorce her and start over with a new flame, Dolores Farris, a dancer from the musical comedy scene. Dolores was more than a fling, she was an investment. Marlo had sunk money into her career, and it seemed his heart as well. But there was a snag, a legal one. Divorce was a trickier business in New York than in Ohio, where the laws were looser. Marlo tried to convince his estranged wife to pack up and settle in Cleveland, but her family sniffed out the scheme and shot it down cold. As for his entanglements with the liquor trade, the city's favorite vice, no one could pin them down with certainty. Commissioner Grover Whalen, ever eager for headlines, painted Marlo as a major player in the booze racket. But Whalen's accusations were thick on flair and thin on facts. What was certain, though, was that Marlo was broke, dead broke, and he owed. To whom? How much? No one could say for sure. But in a world where debts often carried a death sentence, those unanswered questions might have been what pulled the trigger. Had Marlo crossed the wrong man over an unpaid note? Had he muscled into a racket where he didn't belong, hoping to climb out of his financial grave? Or was it something else entirely? An old grudge, a whispered insult, a favor refused? The underworld, for all its noise, kept those answers buried deep. What no one disputed was the final, brutal truth. Frank Marlo was murdered. The end came swiftly, violently, and without ceremony. It was the night of June 24th, 1929, a little past 9 o'clock. His body hit the ground with a sickening thud, a lifeless offering flung from a speeding car. The killers chose their stage with a poet's cruelty, directly across from the gates of Flushing Cemetery, where so many had gone before him. The car vanished into the night, leaving Marlo sprawled among the trees, his life's fortune reduced to blood and broken bones. But the underworld's careful silence met an unexpected witness. Two Bayside men, Charles Brandt and Charles Niccolo, had seen the body fall, a sudden brutal punctuation mark to the evening stillness. They thought he'd been struck down by the car, some poor soul caught in the wrong place. Hearts pounding, they sprinted 4 blocks, each step hammering with urgency, until they reached a police booth. There they found policeman Frederick Sherwood. Together they rushed back to the crumpled figure in the shadows. Sherwood bent low. Marlo was still breathing, but death, cruel and certain, was already tightening its grip. Without hesitation, they lifted his broken body and carried him back to the booth, the weight of a life spent in shadows, heavy in their hands. The case was only beginning. The answers, if they came at all, would be paid for in blood and silence. And for the underworld bosses watching from the wings, one thing was clear. The murder of Frank Marlo was a message. The question was, who sent it? And who would be next? Policeman Frederick Sherwood crouched beside the crumpled figure, his eyes narrowing under the dim light. The man on the ground was barely clinging to life, his breath a faint rattle, but the truth of his murder screamed louder than any dying gasp. 3 bullets, each a signature of cold, professional intent, marked his body. One tore through his right temple, another shattered his jaw, and a third punctured the front of his neck. Around every wound, blackened powder burns, an assassin's calling card, whispered of a point-blank execution. Frank Marlo never stood a chance. Death claimed him before the wail of the ambulance could pierce the night. The police found his name folded in his pocket, and with it, the gears of the city's law machine lurched into motion. By 11 o'clock that night, the scene swarmed with the highest brass of the New York Police Department. Commissioner Grover Whalen, his crisp suit barely touched by the evening breeze. Chief Inspector O'Brien, stone-faced and methodical. Inspector Mulrooney, his sharp eyes sweeping every shadow. And Deputy Commissioner Leach, his polished shoes crunching against gravel as he barked orders. Their first move? Follow the trail backward. It led them to the Victoria Hotel on 7th Avenue near 51st Street, Marlo's last known residence. The lobby was a mausoleum of whispers and knowing glances, but the suite upstairs was sealed tight, locked from the inside. Minutes before Marlo's lifeless body hit the dirt across from Flushing Cemetery, the telephone in his room had rung. A woman's voice, calm, certain, had answered, "Frank isn't here, but he ought to be here any minute." By the time the detectives pressed their badges against the door, that minute had passed into eternity. The room, like the voice, offered no answers, only questions. Next, they retraced his final steps to a familiar haunt. La Tavernelle, a cozy joint on West 52nd Street, where men of Marlo's kind mixed deals with their dinners. The proprietor, Ignatius Copper, played the part of the helpful witness, his apron still dusted with flour. He told the detectives that Marlo had dined alone that evening, tucked quietly behind a grill, a man with nothing but shadows for company. But the truth has a way of slipping through cracks. The police squeezed Copper, and the cracks widened. The story unraveled. Marlo had not been alone. In fact, he had been in company. Company that now sat under the harsh lights of the station, facing the rapid-fire questions of a police force hungry for answers. The list read like a who's who of Marlo's circle. Johnny Wilson, the old friend and fighter from Marlo's glory days. Edward Boston Louis Lewis, a rugged operator from Brookline, Massachusetts. Al Seigel, a dancer with nimble feet and fast friends. Mary Seiden, better known in smoky rooms as Mickey of the Rendezvous, a woman who made her living as much with charm as with connections. And Ignatius Copper himself, the man who had just lied through his teeth about Marlo's solitary supper. All 5 swept from the comforts of the night into the cold metal embrace of custody. Material witnesses, the police called them. But the detectives knew, sometimes, witnesses were just suspects waiting for their turn on the rack. In the background, Commissioner Whalen, ever the optimist, ever the public showman, declared his theory with the certainty of a man holding a solved puzzle. Marlo hadn't been caught unaware. No, he had known the noose was tightening. Days before his murder, Marlo had fled south to Boston, a curious trip, but not without cause. The whispers from Boston's fight halls trailed him back to New York. Weeks earlier, Marlo's fighter, Riccardo Bertazzalo, an Italian heavyweight with fists like sledgehammers, had gone up against Jim Maloney, a local Boston brawler. The bout had ended in chaos. Bertazzalo declared the winner on a foul. But in the back rooms where the real money traded hands, The whispers started. A fixed fight, they said. A payoff, a rigged purse. Marlo had returned to New York with two things: unfinished business and a name he didn't trust. At the Victoria Hotel, he checked in under an alias, Frank Ross, as though a false name could shield him from the bullets already hunting him. But in the underworld, no alias could change your luck. No locked door could keep out the inevitable, and no friend could save you when your time came due. So now, under the harsh glare of interrogation lamps, the witnesses sat. The last five to share bread and wine with a man who died minutes later in a hail of gunfire. The question echoed in every room. Did one of them share more than a meal with Frank Marlo? Because in this city, where fortunes were built on bootleg whiskey and broken promises, death rarely came without an invitation. The Victoria Hotel clerk barely looked up when the man with the weathered face and hard eyes asked for a room. The name scrawled on the register, Frank Ross, was a weak disguise for a man whose shadow loomed large over New York's underworld. But the hotel, stiff with policy and unimpressed by aliases, refused him the cover of falsehood. If Frank Marlo wanted a room, he'd have to use his real name. And so, he did. It was a decision that, in hindsight, felt like the first step toward his grave. He knew he was a marked man, yet his revolver, his old faithful companion, sat uselessly in his luggage, tucked away upstairs. When death came roaring up beside him in a speeding car, he met it with empty hands. Within hours of the killing, Commissioner Grover Whalen was already weaving his favorite narrative, one of imminent triumph. On June 25th, he faced the press, his voice ringing with that signature optimism that had so often preceded failure. "We have developed important leads today in Manhattan," he declared. Bold, certain, unshakable. Then, almost casually, he promised the inevitable. "Formal charges will soon be brought against specific individuals. We are getting important information." His first target was Edward Boston Louis Lewis, a man whose rap sheet was as long as a city block. Assault, liquor smuggling, and assorted crimes had seasoned him well. The police uncovered that Lewis had landed in New York from Boston on June 14th and checked into the President Hotel. But on June 24th, the day Marlo died, Lewis slipped from Manhattan's elegance to Coney Island's shadows, taking a room at the Half Moon Hotel. And he wasn't alone. Al Seigel, the dancer, despite living in Coney Island, took a room with Lewis. Two men, one room, and a storm brewing between them. The investigation pulled a thread that unraveled the whole day's events. Lewis, it turned out, had been chasing fortune on a whisper from the dead man himself. Marlo had given him a tip, a sure thing, he said, on the second race at Aqueduct. Lewis believed him enough to risk $2,700, but fate played a crueler hand. The horse lost. And with it, so did Lewis. That day, the doomed entourage moved as one: Lewis, Seigel, Mickey Seiden, Johnny Wilson and their driver, Ignatius Copper. From the Victoria Hotel, where Copper's sedan idled like a chariot of destiny, they drove straight to the racetrack. Lewis, seething from his loss, watched the money vanish with every pounding hoof. Wilson and Copper, meanwhile, drifted from the group, off to Marlo's apartment, according to Lewis, for reasons unknown. Later, Marlo and the others joined them. By the time they all reached La Tavernelle for dinner, the air was thick with something unspoken. As the plates cleared and the wine dulled the edge of disappointment, the telephone shattered the mood. It was for Johnny Wilson. He rose from the table, leaving Marlo and Mickey Seiden in the din of clinking glasses and whispered deals. But Marlo, restless, felt the tug of unfinished business. He turned to Mickey and said, "I've got a date." And then, with the simplicity of a man walking to his fate, he stepped into the night. Mickey, loyal or curious, or maybe both, followed, calling after him. But she stopped cold. In the weak glow of the streetlights, she saw Marlo slide into an automobile with two men. Two faces she didn't recognize. She opened her mouth, to shout, to call him back. But the night swallowed her voice. Back in his polished suit and with the press hanging on his every word, Commissioner Whalen drove the point home. "Those are the two men we want," he declared, his finger metaphorically stabbing at the unknown figures lurking in Marlo's final seconds. "We have uncovered plenty of leads and subjects for investigation, and are getting more all the time. But leads are not answers, and promises are not justice." Whalen's men reached out to the women closest to Marlo, Mrs. Minnie Curto, his estranged wife, and Dolores Farris, his would-be bride, performing across the Atlantic in the new moon. From London, the news struck Dolores like a blow. She collapsed backstage, the grief choking her performance and silencing her for the night of June 25th. Through tears, she insisted she knew nothing. No enemies, no grudges. Just the man she loved, gone without reason. Meanwhile, the streets of New York kept their secrets, and Whalen's detectives, desperate for a crack in the stone wall of silence, turned their eyes to a different kind of crowd. On the night of June 26th, they swarmed the stands of the Schmeling Uskudun fight, scanning every face in the throng. Their quarry? Boston suspects, the men who might have brought their unfinished business from the ring to the street. The bell rang. Fists flew. But outside the ring, the fight for Frank Marlo's killer was only beginning. The telephone wires, cold and indifferent, held whispers of betrayal and blood. Commissioner Whalen, desperate for a breakthrough, ordered his men to comb through every call made by Marlo's associates, local and long distance. The static yielded a spark. Boston Louis Lewis. He had placed a series of calls, each leading to a curious payoff. $3,500 wired from Boston shortly afterward. Whalen, his voice sharp with suspicion, offered the public his verdict. "Lewis has not given a satisfactory explanation of this incident." Under pressure, Lewis squirmed and spun a story. The money he claimed was nothing more than a balm for his bruised ego payout to cover his losses at the track. A gambler's excuse, paper-thin and twice as flimsy. But the trail from Boston didn't end with Lewis. On June 27th, news shot down from the north. New York detectives scouring the Boston underworld were closing in on a name. Michael Rocco, known in certain circles as Mickey the Wise Guy. Rocco, the word was, had been seen lurking in Flushing just before Marlo's murder. By morning, he was back in Boston, swift, clean, and sudden, the hallmark of a man with something to hide. The manhunt closed fast. Rocco was found, questioned, and, much to Whalen's chagrin, released. The Boston police, tight-lipped and bristling, resented the uninvited stomp of New York badges on their turf. Whalen, burning with frustration, called it a setback, but only for a moment. He emerged from his office by the evening of June 27th, his usual veneer of optimism polished back into place. "We are closing in," he promised the press, his eyes blazing. "The arrest of Marlo's killers may come within hours." The pressure was on. Whalen knew his career was wedded to the outcome of this case. The botched Rothstein investigation, still a raw wound, had left his reputation bleeding in the gutter. Now, with the Marlo affair, he smelled redemption. And then, on June 30th, he got what he thought was his prize. A flurry of blue coats descended on a fortified hideout in Long Island City, smashing through doors and dragging out Daniel Grosso and Nicholas McDermott. Grosso, an outlaw with a pedigree of violence, was no stranger to bloodshed. He was already notorious for Elizabeth, New Jersey, mail robbery, a heist steeped in gunfire and bodies. And there was something more, something personal. Whalen stepped forward, seizing the moment with the theatre of a man accustomed to the spotlight. "I am sure we now have in custody the men who killed Marlo," he declared, his voice cutting through the static of flashbulbs and scribbling pens. The story, as Wayland told it, was a parable of betrayal. Grosso and Marlo, once uneasy allies, had seen their partnership crumble beneath the weight of desperation. When Grosso needed a hole to hide in, it was Marlo who had bankrolled his disappearance. But when Marlo's own fortune turned to dust, he cut Grosso loose, cold, sudden, and broke. The underworld, after all, offered no safety nets. And Grosso, left to the wolves, festered with resentment. It was easy, then, for Marlo's unseen enemies to stoke that fire. They slipped into Grosso's ear, whispering of betrayal. They painted Marlo not as a former friend, but as a Judas who sold him out. Grosso, fueled by anger and opportunity, became the hand that pulled the trigger. But in the underworld, truths are never what they seem. Wayland's triumph began to sour within days. The foundation of his grand narrative crumbled beneath him. The charges against Grosso and McDermott, so loudly announced, fell to pieces. Mistaken identification, the court said. The murder charge evaporated, but the city, unwilling to let the pair vanish into the night, held them fast under $50,000 bail, material witnesses to a crime Wayland no longer seemed able to solve. And there was another twist, a political one. The Union County, New Jersey police, with their own bone to pick with Grosso, expected him to be sent south. They wanted his neck for the mail robbery murder that had made him infamous, but Wayland, in a move that left them seething, threw up a wall. He asked Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt himself to hold the extradition request. New York wasn't finished with Grosso. Not yet. The tension between the states stretched thin, and the case itself, so bright with promise, fell back into shadow. But on July 8th, from the Stoneheart of police headquarters, came another headline, a promise fresh and sharp as a knife. The hunt wasn't over, and neither was the story of Frank Marlo. Commissioner Grover Wayland, ever the showman, tightened his grip on the spotlight and dropped a bombshell. Frank Marlo's murder, he declared, had been ordered and paid for by the head of an Italian secret society. The papers seized on it, their headlines screaming a grand underworld conspiracy. And the first name to tumble out of the police dragnet was one that turned every head from Mulberry Street to the Bronx, Ciro Terranova, the so-called Artichoke King, a man who had squeezed fortunes from vegetables and violence alike. Terranova, with his armored touring car and his iron grip on the produce rackets, was whisked to police headquarters for questioning. But Wayland, ever coy, dashed any notion of triumph. Terranova is not the man, he told the reporters, leaving them and the city thirsting for more. The Artichoke King walked free. His name was bruised, but his wrists were unshackled. Wayland wanted something better, something bigger. Meanwhile, the five who had shared Marlo's final meal, Mickey Seiden, Johnny Wilson, Ignatius Copper, Edward Boston Louis Lewis, and Al Seigel, remained caged under $50,000 bail each. Wayland had no illusions. Evidence was one thing, but pressure cracked stones and souls alike. He aimed to keep them locked up until their nerves broke. Johnny Wilson could solve the Marlo murder mystery in 5 minutes, Wayland told the press on July 11th, his voice dripping with certainty. And he wasn't done. Mickey Seiden knows more than she's letting on. She remembers everything, up until the moment she chased after Marlo. And then, suddenly she's blank. A convenient lapse, Wayland suggested, one born not of shock, but of fear. On July 12th, Mickey faced a test. The police placed her behind a one-way mirror. On the other side, Ciro Terranova, his broad back to her. If he was the man who had guided Marlo into the car of death, this was her chance to say so. She didn't hesitate. "No," she said, her voice flat. That's not him. Terranova, who had already buried brothers in the endless vendetta of gang feuds, was struck from the suspect list, and walked out into the summer air, a free man. But Wayland's net stretched beyond New York. His men hit Boston's streets, kicking up dirt and whispers. They weren't just chasing foot soldiers. They wanted a vanished politician, a man from Boston's smoky back rooms. The whispers said he was a bootlegger, a forger, a dealer in false revenue stamps and bad liquor. And more than that, he was scared. He had told his closest cronies that if the law came knocking, he'd vanish into the cracks until the heat cooled. And he had. Then, the name that shook the underworld fell into Wayland's lap. Joseph Masseria, Joe the Boss, the man whose name was both legend and warning, a kingmaker, a killer, the sun around which every racket from gambling to extortion revolved. The whisper on every corner was that it had been Masseria, who had given the nod that sent Frank Marlo to his grave. The police found him at 62 2nd Avenue, Manhattan. His reputation walked 3 steps ahead of him, brutal, untouchable, and more feared than bullets. But when the law came knocking, even Joe the Boss answered. He was taken to headquarters under the cold eye of Inspector Mulrooney, who oversaw the grilling with the relish of a man eyeing a prize buck. But Wayland, who had made the promise of justice into a public spectacle, was nowhere to be found, out of town. And so, the dance between cop and king ended not with a confession, but a dismissal. Mulrooney let Masseria walk. When Wayland returned to the city, his fury burned hot. But he was not done fighting, not by a long shot. On July 19th, he marched into court to block Mickey Siden's attempt at freedom. She had filed for a writ of habeas corpus, hoping to breathe air outside the grey walls of her cell. Wayland stood before Justice Black, his voice sharp, his words cutting through the legal niceties, like a blade. "This was no street shooting," Wayland said, his eyes locked on the judge. "This was a private execution. Gangland decided Frank Marlo must die. And Miss Siden," he gestured sharply. "She was in the company of Gangland. She worked for Gangland. First at the Silver Slipper, Gangland's playground. When Gangland moved to Rendezvous, she moved with it. She knows." Then, for the first time since the investigation began, Wayland dropped a revelation. After leaving La Tavernelle, Mickey Siden had gone straight to Marlo's suite at the Victoria Hotel. The courtroom air turned electric. Mickey, who had claimed she lost Marlo in the street, had followed him further than anyone knew. Right to his door. The noose was tightening, but around whose neck, no one could yet say. The truth, like a stubborn shadow, had clung to Mickey Siden from the start. It was her voice on the line that night, the one that told the caller Frank Marlo would be back soon. Her voice, casual, unknowing, marking the countdown to his death. Wayland knew it. The department knew it. And now, with her on the brink of freedom, they sounded the alarm. If Mickey walked, they warned, she wouldn't make it far. Gangland would catch her and kill her. Wayland, his voice hard with frustration, insisted, "She will be murdered if she is set free." But the court was deaf to fear. On July 22nd, they slashed her bail to $25,600, and by the next morning Mickey was free, but with death breathing down her neck. Wayland, battered but unbowed, turned his aim back to the man who haunted every corner of this case, the man who had long been whispered to sit at the very top of the criminal pyramid, Joe Masseria. Joe, the Boss. On July 23rd, he faced the press once more. His voice, still strong, carried a bitter edge. "We have before us today Joe Masseria, otherwise known as Joe the Boss. We have questioned him frequently before and will continue to question him." The question that burned in every reporter's throat came fast. "Is Masseria the head of the secret Italian society? The man you said paid for Marlo's murder?" Wayland's answer was measured but heavy. "He is one of them." But then, for the first time since the hunt began, the cracks showed. The optimism, so often Wayland's armor, thinned into something closer to resignation. His voice, as he continued, carried the weight of every locked door and every silent witness. "We can get a lot of bases for suspicion, information and belief," he admitted, his words slow, tired. "It is surprising how freely people will talk about the dead. They've told us everything about Marlo, from his childhood until the moment he walked out of La Tavernelle to his death. But when asked about living, their memory suddenly fails." The dam was breaking, and not in Wayland's favor. The survivors of that fateful dinner, the ones he had kept in custody with the hope that pressure would force their tongues, slipped through his fingers one by one. Johnny Wilson, the man Wayland swore could solve the case in 5 minutes, walked free on $30,000 bail. Edward Boston Louis. Lewis, the gambler with a grudge and a lost fortune, followed on $30,000 bail. Al Seigel, whose only crime, perhaps, was knowing the wrong people, was released on $10,000 bail. And finally, Ignatius Copper, the driver who had carried them all from racetrack to restaurant to ruin, was let go for a mere $5,000 bail. In the end, it was Wayland, not the suspects, who broke. With the press snapping at his heels, he threw up his hands in bitter surrender. The air of inevitability, the stink of another unsolved Gangland killing, choked his voice. The Marlo case was dying, and Wayland knew it. It was the Rothstein fiasco, all over again. And before Rothstein, a dozen others. And after Marlo, there would be more, always more. Another name would be carved in bullets, another body would be tossed from a car or gunned down in a restaurant. And Wayland would be back before the cameras, back to his statements, back to his baseless promises, back to the cycle he could never break. The truth was this: the underworld was a government all its own. It issued its sentences in darkened rooms, carried them out on lonely streets, and buried its secrets deep. And Wayland, who had spent his career chasing shadows, had learned the hard truth. Interfering with gangland justice was like trying to halt an execution in a foreign country. It wasn't a crime, it was policy, and there was no appeal. Perhaps, Wayland admitted to himself in a rare moment of candor, one day someone would come along, someone with the brains, the nerve and the instincts to crack these cases wide open. Someone who could tear the veil from the underworld and drag its kings, kicking and screaming, into the light of justice. But if that man ever arrived, he would have to be more than just clever, more than just dogged. He would have to be everything Wayland wasn't. The Hotsy Totsy Club was never just another speakeasy. It was where deals were made and broken, where racketeers and tough guys gathered under the soft glow of hanging chandeliers, sipping bootleg whiskey, while the city outside held its breath. But in the early hours of a humid Saturday morning in July 1929, it became something else entirely. Simon Walker and William Cassidy were dead before they hit the floor. Whatever they had done, whoever they had crossed, the end had been waiting for them the moment they stepped through the club's doors. The first theory was simple. Two drunks were getting carried away, a few too many words exchanged, and suddenly pistols were drawn in the heat of the moment. But the detectives, working on the case, weren't buying it. The charges told the real story. First-degree murder. This wasn't a duel. It was an execution. By the time the grand jury handed down the indictments, Broadway's underworld was already bracing itself. The papers called him an overlord, but in reality, he was more than that. He was the man who decided who lived, who died, and who got to keep their piece of the city. When Judge Donnellan signed the warrants, the police wasted no time. They spread out across Manhattan, shaking down every criminal haunt from the Bowery to Harlem. The break in the case came from an unlikely source, a singing waiter. Thomas Marola had been called in for the third time. And this time, he finally gave them something they could use. Whatever he had seen that night, whatever truth he had been sitting on, was enough to put 2 men on the chopping block. The only question was whether they would be found before they disappeared into the city's underworld for good. Meanwhile, another name was starting to resurface, one that had a way of showing up whenever the bullets started flying. Joe Masseria, the same Masseria who had dodged death on the Bowery years earlier, whose hat had been shot off his head in a botched ambush while the gunman mowed down innocent bystanders just to escape. He had been a name whispered in every gambling den and bootlegging ring for years. Now, he was back in police custody, not just for the hotsy-totsy killings, but for something bigger. Frankie Marlo was dead. A racketeer, a fight manager, a man with his hands in all the right places. Marlo had been gunned down, and the cops were looking for answers. They had Masseria, and they had little Augie Pisano sitting in the same cell, both dragged in for questioning. But this was how these things always played out. Men like Masseria never talked. The law could keep asking, keep pressing, but when the dust settled, they'd walk right back out onto the street. And that's exactly what happened. The only thing the cops could do was keep watching, waiting for another mistake. Less than a year later, they got their chance. March 1930. Miami. The crackdown came in the middle of the night, the kind of raid that felt like it had been ripped straight from the days of Arnold Rothstein. The place was a palace, top floor of a luxury hotel where the air was thick with cigar smoke and the whiskey flowed like it was still Prohibition. The fight crowd was in town. The Scott-Sharkey match had drawn in the kind of men who lived for high stakes, and the money was pouring in. The cops came in fast. $73,000 sat on the tables, stacked in neat piles, waiting to be won, lost, and passed around again. The old-timers knew how this worked. Rothstein had made his fortune running these kinds of games, and now, even in death, his shadow loomed over Miami's underworld. But this time, the house didn't win. The biggest roll of cash, $60,000, belonged to one man, Charles Lucania. Back in New York, they called him Lucky. But here in Miami, his luck had just run out. The police booked him on vagrancy and illegal gambling. They lined up the rest of the players, checking their names against their records, looking for the ones they wanted to bury. And right there, mixed in with the high rollers, was Masseria. It was as if he had been waiting for them. For a man who had spent his life ducking the law, he had a way of turning up in all the wrong places. The question wasn't whether he'd walk free this time. It was how long before he was back in a police lineup, another body on the ground, another vendetta in the making. The game never really ended. It just changed hands. By the spring of 1931, Joe Masseria should have seen it coming. The signs were there, scattered across the past decade like discarded shell casings, botched hits, endless police interrogations, and rivals closing in on all sides. He had survived more bullets than most men had cigars, but in the end, it wasn't a rival's pistol he needed to fear. It was the empty chair at his own card table. For years, Masseria had been the undisputed king of New York's underworld, a man who turned street wars into business deals, who ruled his empire with a butcher's hands. He had outlasted Umberto Valenti, crushed rivals, and survived shootouts that should have ended him. Even when he was arrested in Miami, shoulder to shoulder with Lucky Luciano at a high-stakes poker table, he still managed to walk free. That raid should have been his first warning. The Miami game had been a who's who of Times Square's underworld. 19 gamblers, enough cigar smoke to blot out the moon, and more money piled on the table than most men made in a lifetime. But it was Lucania, the young up-and-comer with the jagged scar along his jaw, who held the big money. $60,000 in cash sat in his grip, thick, as a cabbage head. The others barely had $13,000 between them. One poor fool clung to 12 cents, still convinced his luck would turn before the night was over. When the deputies stormed in, pistols drawn, everyone in the room knew the game was over. But it wasn't the police Masseria should have worried about. It was the young men around the table, the ones who weren't laughing anymore. Miami was just another crack in the foundation. By April 1931, the walls were closing in. Masseria had spent years fighting to hold his kingdom together, but now the betrayals were happening in whispers. Deals were being made behind his back, and the very men he had once trusted, men like Luciano, were playing both sides. The old ways were crumbling. A new order was on the horizon, one that didn't have room for an old king who didn't know when to step aside. And so, on a quiet afternoon in Coney Island, it ended. The Nuova Villa Tamaro was nothing special, just another cafe where men in silk suits sat with their backs to the wall and played cards while the world outside went about its business. Masseria was relaxed, a hand of pinochle in front of him, the ace of spades still clutched in his fingers when death arrived. The killers didn't waste time. 2 men entered the restaurant, silent as ghosts. No last words, no hesitation. 5 shots rang out, each one finding its mark. Masseria never got a chance to rise from his chair. The 3 men who had been playing cards with him vanished. No screams, no protests, just empty seats and the quiet rustling of topcoats left behind in their haste to get away from the slaughter. Even the money, $40 in bills scattered near the table, was abandoned. The cops didn't need a confession to know what had happened. It was an inside job, a setup. By the time Masseria's body hit the floor, his reign was already over. For years, he had fought to keep men like Capone out of Brooklyn. He had made enemies out of the wrong people, underestimating the younger generation that had been waiting for their chance. Now, with his lifeless body sprawled beneath the table, his empire lay in ruins. The future belonged to the men who had left that cafe alive. It belonged to Lucky Luciano. When the bullets stopped flying inside the Nuova Villa Tamaro, Joe Masseria was sprawled across the floor, his lifeless fingers still gripping the ace of spades, the death card. His empire, built on blood, bootlegging and brute force, was now leaderless. But in the underworld, power never stays vacant for long. In the hours following his execution, the men who had once sworn loyalty to Joe the Boss moved quickly. They gathered in the dimly lit rooms of his $15,000 duplex on West 81st Street, a fortress built from the spoils of vice. It was more than just a meeting. It was a war council. The old boss was dead, but the streets still needed an answer. 25 of Masseria's most trusted enforcers were present. These weren't politicians or businessmen. These were men who settled disputes with .38s and Thompson's submachine guns. As the police fumbled to untangle the web of Masseria's connections, his men were already one step ahead, locking down rackets, shifting alliances, and, most importantly, protecting the boss's family. His widow, Giuseppe, and their 6 children remained inside the apartment, their grief drowned out by the presence of armed guards stationed at every door. The streets outside were crawling with detectives, but nobody on the inside was talking. Across the river in Jersey City, police picked up a man named Anthony DeVere. He was driving a car registered to Charles Starapata, the same address as the Nuova Villa Tamaro, where Masseria had drawn his last breath. The cops knew it was no coincidence, but in the world of gangland justice, a name on a registration form meant nothing without a man willing to talk. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, detectives combed over the blue Buick used in the hit. It had been dumped on First Avenue in Coney Island, stripped of any immediate evidence, just another corpse in the long line of cars abandoned after a gangland execution. The investigation felt like a formality. Everybody knew what had happened, Masseria had been set up. But the real question wasn't who pulled the trigger, it was who gave the order. A bloody throne. For years, the underworld had been at war over a name that still sent a chill down the spines of those who whispered it: Frankie Yale. Since Yale's spectacular demise in 1928, Brooklyn's rackets had been soaked in blood. Men who dared to lay claim to his empire ended up in the same place, face down in the gutter, riddled with bullets. The police had a list. Michael Abatimarco shot dead in his car. Joe Riggio, gunned down in front of his own home. Louis Notti left dying in a vacant lot. Salvatore Folanzo, stuffed into an icebox. Joseph Ciccarelli, murdered inside his own house. Now Masseria had joined them. It wasn't just about power. It was about legacy. Masseria had seen himself as Yale's natural successor, the man to unite Brooklyn under his iron grip. But ambition in the underworld came at a price, and Masseria had just paid it in full. The problem was, even in death, his shadow still loomed. The show of power. His men made sure of that. If Masseria's enemies thought they could erase his legacy, they would die wrong. His funeral would be the most extravagant farewell New York had ever seen. Bigger than Frankie Yale. Bigger than Frankie Marlo. It would be a testament to the life he had lived and the fear he had commanded. The streets would be lined with mourners. Floral arrangements spelling out his name would stretch for blocks. The suits, the cars, the quiet nods of respect from men who had once feared him, it would all be there. But beneath the grandeur, the truth remained. Joe the Boss was gone. And in the world he had ruled, there were no eulogies. Only the next shot fired. Joe Masseria was dead, but the city wasn't finished with him yet. The old rules dictated that a fallen boss got a funeral to match his stature, a spectacle of wealth and power, a final show of force even in death. But this time, the city had had enough. There would be no grand procession, no brass bands playing solemn dirges through the streets of Little Italy, no velvet-draped hearse crawling past crowds of mourners. New York had drawn a line. The order came straight from the top. No more gangster funerals turned into parades of defiance. If the underworld wanted to send off their dead, they would do so in silence. The churches refused to open their doors. The police denied every permit. No street demonstrations, no public outpouring of grief. Just a burial, quick, quiet, and devoid of spectacle. For the first time, the city had taken control of the narrative. The gangsters had built an empire on blood. But now, they weren't even allowed to celebrate their dead. And maybe that was the final humiliation for Joe the Boss. His men had promised a funeral that would put Frankie Yales to shame, a send-off that would freeze the city in its tracks. Instead, Masseria went into the ground without a single trumpet to mark his passing. Masseria's death was more than just the fall of a kingpin. It was a symptom of something larger, an underworld in freefall. The criminal empire that had once seemed indestructible was now cracking under its own weight, the rackets shrinking, the alliances fracturing. Bootlegging, once the golden goose of the mob, was collapsing. The liquor trade, once a river of easy money, had turned into a slow bleed. Prices had plunged. The market was oversaturated. Even the rum runners couldn't keep up. Ships sat off the New York coast for months, their captains desperate to unload cargo that no one was buying. And where there was desperation, there was violence. Jack Legs. Diamond had barely escaped death in the Catskills after a Brooklyn beer runner tried muscling into his territory. Dutch Schultz was making moves outside the Bronx, testing the patience of rivals who wouldn't tolerate an overreach. Vanny Higgins had tried to expand onto Long Island, only to be crushed by the feds before he could establish a foothold. Even the small-time operators were fighting for scraps. New Jersey moonshiners were in open war with New York beer racketeers. the so-called Applejack Wars erupting in the backwoods as distillers defended their turf. The new frontier wasn't liquor anymore. It was narcotics. And at the center of it all was Jack Diamond. The authorities had begun to suspect that Diamond's real empire wasn't built on beer trucks. It was built on something stronger, something far more profitable. Investigators traced his movements, whispering that his trip to Amsterdam, New York, wasn't about bootlegging at all. It was about drugs. If Diamond had pulled it off, he could have stepped into the shoes of Arnold Rothstein himself, seizing control of New York's narcotics trade. But now, it looked like he wouldn't live long enough to see his empire grow. He lay in an Albany hospital, riddled with bullet holes, gasping for air as pleurisy threatened to turn into pneumonia. His rivals weren't waiting to see if he'd recover. The government had finally stepped in, not just local cops, not just state officials, but a joint task force between New York and federal agents. For the first time, the feds and the state were working together, hell-bent on dismantling the mob. And as Diamond clung to life, the streets were watching. Would he pull through? Or was he just another boss about to meet the same fate as Joe Masseria? The underworld was collapsing. And soon there would be no kings left to rule it. Sinister rumbles of discontent and violent upheavals in the gang world have erupted into battles between rival liquor and narcotics mobs, signaling what many believe to be the beginning of a deflation of underworld interests along the Atlantic seaboard. Hard times have hit the mobsters, and like rats trapped in a shrinking cage, they have begun to turn on one another. Greene County chaos and the collapse of syndicates. The recent Greene County uproar, brought to a head by the near-fatal shooting of Jack Legs Diamond, reflects a desperate and disordered state within the crime syndicates. Once interconnected directorates have crumbled, leaving maverick killers invading each other's strongholds in search of shrinking profits. Within the past year, New York liquor prices have plummeted, falling faster than United States steel and triggering a savage price war among wholesalers. The result? A deadly combination of oversupply and cutthroat competition. The Royal Stranger, a rum-running vessel from Halifax, was forced to idle offshore for 4 months, unable to unload its cargo. Despite the captain's desperate negotiations with mob emissaries, the ship ultimately returned to Halifax empty-handed, its crew near starvation and laden with bitterness and gloom. With profits evaporating in urban markets, gangsters have begun expanding into summer resort areas and rural regions, leading to violent clashes with established interests. Key flashpoints in the gang wars. First was the Catskills. Joe Coglianese, a Brooklyn beer runner, invaded Diamond's Catskills territory and collided with Paul Quattrocchi, Diamond's lieutenant. Second was the ensuing conflict led to casualties, and Quattrocchi was arrested for felonious assault. Brooklyn. Joe Boss Masseria, desperate to replace dwindling Harlem profits, attempted to seize territory controlled by the Capone-Aiello syndicate in Brooklyn. This bold move resulted in Masseria's assassination, marking his grand funeral as his final chapter. Third was Long Island. Vannie Higgins' beer mob, expanding its operations, was caught by federal agents in collaboration with Mineola police officers and hotel owners, all of whom now face trial. Fourth was rural New Jersey and New York. City beer racketeers have begun intruding upon traditional moonshine operations, sparking rumors of wars and violent reprisals in the Applejack regions. Fifth was Bronx. Arthur Dutch Schultz, head of the Bronx beer mob, has been accused of overstepping his boundaries, prompting business rivals to prepare violent countermeasures. Diamond's true empire. Narcotics. While most mobsters scramble for control of liquor rackets, Jack Legs, Diamond's true focus appears to be narcotics. Evidence suggests that Diamond's October trip to Amsterdam, New York, just before he was shot at the Monticello Hotel, was tied to drug deals. Had his plans succeeded, Diamond might have become the successor to the late Arnold Rothstein, who had been the original mastermind of New York's narcotics trade. The government strikes back. For the first time, state and federal officials are working together to dismantle the liquor and narcotics empires. Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt has sent Attorney General John J. Bennett to Greene County with clear orders to destroy the diamond mob. This move is unprecedented in a state that repealed its liquor enforcement laws 5 years ago. Rural hideouts for drug lords' authorities. Note that it is not uncommon for narcotics traffickers to establish their headquarters in picturesque rural areas. A few years ago, notorious gangsters such as Monk Eastman and Dopey Benny Fine turned Jack London's idyllic Valley of the Moon in California into a drug distribution hub for the Pacific Coast. Now it seems that Diamond and others may be following a similar pattern, using secluded locales to orchestrate their operations. Diamond under siege. As Diamond lies recovering from gunshot wounds in an Albany hospital, his position is increasingly precarious. Federal and state officials are piling legal charges against him, including kidnapping, illegal gun possession, and operating illicit stills through his henchmen. Despite Attorney General Bennett's call for locals to come forward with information, fear of reprisals has left many residents unwilling to cooperate. Meanwhile, Diamond's battle with pleurisy complicates his recovery, leaving him vulnerable to pneumonia, even as his empire collapses around him. The beginning of the end. With rising intergang violence, plummeting profits, and unprecedented government intervention, the Atlantic seaboard's criminal underworld appears to be entering a period of steep decline. As the old alliances disintegrate, the once mighty syndicates are reduced to scavengers, tearing each other apart in the scramble for survival. The underworld was running out of places to hide. For years, the crime syndicates along the Atlantic seaboard had moved like ghosts, untouchable, unstoppable, their fortunes built on the river of liquor that flowed through every speakeasy from Manhattan to Miami. But by 1931, the money was drying up, and with it, the carefully balanced order that had once held Gangland together. The price wars, the betrayals, the double crosses. It was all leading to one inevitable conclusion: collapse. The first cracks had appeared in the Catskills. Jack Legs Diamond had carved out his territory in the quiet summer resorts of upstate New York, controlling the flow of booze to the wealthy city elite who vacationed there. But greed was a hungry thing, and Joe Coglinese, a Brooklyn beer runner, saw an opportunity. He pushed into Diamond's domain, and just like that, the peace was shattered. The bullets flew. Diamond's enforcer Paul Quattrocchi landed in jail, and Diamond himself barely escaped an assassination attempt. Then came Masseria. Desperate to replace the profits slipping through his fingers in Harlem, he made a move on Brooklyn, territory controlled by the Capone-Aiello syndicate. It was a gamble, the kind that either paid off in power or ended in blood. For Masseria, it ended with his body sprawled in a Coney Island restaurant, a handful of playing cards still clutched in his fingers. The funeral he had envisioned, a grand spectacle of wealth and influence, never materialized. The city had put its foot down. No more gangster parades. No more brass bands, mourning men who had built their empires on murder. The government had drawn its line in the sand. With bootlegging profits in freefall, the once mighty syndicates found themselves scrambling for new ways to keep the money flowing. Some, like Vannie Higgins, tried expanding onto Long Island. It didn't last. Federal agents swooped in, sweeping up a network of corrupt police officers and hotel owners before the racket could take root. Others turned to rural New Jersey, muscling in on the moonshine operations that had been running long before Prohibition even existed. That, too, was met with gunfire. Then there was Dutch Schultz, smart, ruthless, and unafraid to cross the wrong lines. He had spent years controlling the Bronx, but now, with the old world crumbling, he wanted more. Rivals took notice. The violence was coming. But while the others tore each other apart over scraps of the liquor trade, Jack Diamond was playing a different game. The papers still called Diamond a bootlegger, a beer baron, a man fighting for control of whiskey and gin. But the truth was more dangerous. Diamond wasn't after liquor. He was after something bigger: narcotics. It had been Arnold Rothstein's game before him, the hidden empire that had kept the money flowing even when Prohibition would eventually end. Diamond had learned from the best, and his October trip to Amsterdam, New York, hadn't been about beer. It had been about setting up the next phase of his operation. If he had succeeded, he would have been untouchable. But he hadn't. Instead, he was shot, bleeding out in a Monticello hotel room while the walls of his empire collapsed around him. Now, as he lay in an Albany hospital, barely clinging to life, the government was moving in. Franklin Roosevelt himself had ordered the crackdown, sending Attorney General John Bennett into Greene County with a single directive: destroy the Diamond Mob. And this time, there was no escape. They were hitting him from every angle. Federal and state charges were piling up: kidnapping, illegal weapons, the operation of illicit stills. There were whispers that he had already been marked for another hit, that his enemies weren't willing to wait for the government to finish him off. And even if he survived, even if he somehow walked out of that hospital, he wouldn't be walking into the empire he had built. It was already gone, ripped apart by the same forces that had taken down Masseria, that were now coming for Schultz, Higgins, and the rest. The days of untouchable gangsters ruling the streets were over. Now, they were just rats in a trap, gnawing at each other, waiting for the walls to close in.